What I wanted to go over was just the syllabus, talk about my own approach and methodology a bit, and then discuss the readings a little bit, namely the readings that we're going to go through, how we're going to do that, and then get to certain aspects of today's reading in Batoni, which I find is a very helpful introductory text that has an approach that's quite sympathetic to the approach that I hope to take in this seminar, and we hope to take in this seminar. So hopefully go ahead, Alex.
I wanted to interject. I've done webinars like this before, and with people that don't have audio, if you open up your message bar, you can put an X, and then hit enter, and then it will show up, and Jared can see it, and then know that there's somebody over there that wants to ask a question.
Let's see here.
And any of us can do that. You can just put an X, and then you can say, oh, you can see who it's from.
Okay, got it. Thanks. That's great. So in terms of the syllabus, has everyone got a copy of it and had a chance to look through it? Okay, good. Basically, the main approach is attempting to gather together the various threads of the Franciscan intellectual tradition in order to present a kind of coherent and synthetic whole. Many people tend to look at the Franciscan tradition as a major break in spirit and methodology from St. Francis, then a major break in spirit from St. Francis to St. Bonaventure, and then another break from St. Bonaventure to Duns Scotus. Now, I think that is a plausible account if you approach it from a non-metaphysical point of view, meaning a point of view that sees unities in thought or reality only in terms of commonality of terms or modes of expression. But I think a better approach is to try to see what is trying to be conveyed through the terms that are being used and what is being emphasized or clarified in the implementation of new terms. So, for example, there seems to be a clear distinction and approach between, say, the life and activities of St. Francis, and Batoni brings this out, and then the kind of intellectual transposition that St. Francis's vision undergoes in, say, the person and writings of St. Bonaventure, and the effect of his activity and teaching on the Franciscan order. But I think a better way to approach it, rather than seeing St. Francis as being betrayed by St. Bonaventure in terms of allowing study in the order and sending friars to the university and emphasizing the ability to possess, say, the tools necessary for academic study, such as books and writing implements. I think it's better to understand that St. Bonaventure himself recognizes the uniqueness of St. Francis, but yet in St. Francis's uniqueness, Francis was acting as a truly Catholic, a totally Catholic and apostolic man, meaning that what he did is both an example, but also a fact or reality of teaching of the way that one can be a Christian in the church. And so it's not a matter of saying we have to imitate St. Francis on every point. We actually have to accommodate or take on the mind of St. Francis insofar as we recognize the truths and goodness that he put forth, namely, the emphasis on divine goodness, the emphasis on total abandonment of one's own desires and of one's own pursuits to a radical dependency upon God, and an embracing of first spiritual poverty, but then living this out in a kind of physical poverty, a mendicant mode of life. What St. Bonaventure is doing is saying, well, yes, St. Francis is our founder, and it is in a way unique with respect to the order. But on the other hand, his insights into the primacy of charity, the need for total dependence upon God, the need to live the gospel life in a kind of radical and unqualified way, sine glossa, they say, is what St. Bonaventure is then seeing as important to be diffused to those people who cannot live in the same manner as Francis did himself. And so he's trying to translate what St. Francis did in terms of those principles and insights in ways of living of St. Francis that can be transferred to an order and diffused through the entirety of the church. So St. Francis brought forth a certain insights into theological vision and outlook that St. Bonaventure transposed, in a sense, into a different key, into a different set of instruments, such that Bonaventure can speak in a way that's common to all Christians, and especially Christians within the Franciscan order, without having to reduce every Christian to an exact carbon copy of St. Francis. And so what you see then is not really a departure, a contradiction of St. Francis. You see rather a transformation of what St. Francis did into an intellectual idiom, so that it can be then communicated in a manner that's coherent and in continuity with what St. Francis did. The same thing, I think, arguably can be said with Bonaventure and Scotus. For example, Bonaventure used the metaphor of divine illumination in order to explain how human beings come to know with certainty, how to make certain judgments in the wake of, or in the context of, the radical changeability of both their minds, the things that are known, and the very acts of judgment. He used this notion of divine illumination to say, well, this is what provides, on an ontological and ultimately theological level, certain judgment. This is what explains this. Scotus doesn't use the language of illumination, and many people think that he rejected it completely. But I think a better approach is the one that Father Peter offers, and before him, people like Ephraim Batoni, in some articles, is rather what happened was, in the period of time, say, between the death of St. Bonaventure in 1274 and the rise of Scotus in the late 1290s, there was, what would you say, 25 years or so, 20 years or so, of theological and philosophical development and speculation that took the notion of divine illumination into a more fideistic direction, which tended to undermine any kind of natural, integral role that the intellect and nature plays in terms of coming to certain judgments. So what it ended up, through people like Henry of Ghent, divine illumination becoming, was a notion of kind of a radical fideism. Ultimately, the only thing that justifies any kind of knowledge that we have is a continuous, in terms of time, but punctuated, meaning point by point, act by act, divine illumination, such to the effect that God is constantly intervening in the cognitive faculties to zap them, so to speak, with the necessary components so that human beings could arrive at certain knowledge. There was no place for just the natural operations of the mind. It became subsumed into just a pure supernaturalism. And so divine illumination took on a connotation that we will find later on, let's see, in weeks, let me look here, in about week 3, we'll find that with Henry of Ghent, divine illumination took on a connotation that was really quite contrary to what St. Bonaventure was arguing. Bonaventure was arguing more to the effect that divine illumination simply is the created image being a created image. So it's a unique mode of God's continuous activity with the image, so that the image, like God, can know with certainty. So in this sense, divine illumination and God's activity is very closely analogous to God's created activity with respect to non-personal beings. And so Bonaventure was just simply saying that divine illumination is in some way natural to human persons. So in this sense, it was the opposite direction. Bonaventure was using divine illumination to explain an opposite point, or a point in contrast to what Henry of Ghent would use it as. And so Scotus rejected or ceased using the language of divine illumination. But many historians, if they don't understand really the intent of St. Bonaventure, will say that Scotus rejected this. But Father Peter, people like Father Peter and Ephraim Bettoni point out, is it's not so much that Scotus is rejecting divine illumination, because he preserves the central metaphysical and epistemological insights of Bonaventure. Rather, Scotus is just simply translating illumination, which we will get into greater detail as the course goes on, into a more logical format, and in a certain sense, less dangerous format of logical concepts and their application. So Scotus, instead of speaking of divine illumination to explain certain judgments, he speaks of univocity, ultimately the univocal concept of being. While on the one hand, this is certainly an advance or refinement, logically, upon the system of St. Bonaventure and his theory of divine illumination. On the other hand, univocal concepts of being the univocal concept of being has raised or caused or created its own problems in terms of the apprehension or understanding of just what this term means. Many people think, and this is all just preparing the way for later discussion, many people assume that the univocal concept of being is simply saying that being is a kind of thing that exists out there in the world prior to anything else that exists. And so anything that exists is really a participation in being. And so what happens is you have this notion of being. So the objectors to Scotus, especially modern day objectors to Scotus, say, is you have this universal reality of being, quite undefined even by the critics, that then God participates in and creatures participate in. And so what that does is it seems to subordinate God to something prior to himself, namely being, and then it places God and creation or created beings in a relationship of sharing a common genus, which of course is false. And so understood that way, univocal being is a problematic doctrine. But of course, Scotus doesn't mean that. And we'll look at this more closely as we move along. But my point is simply to say that Scotus is moving away from divine illumination. While it is a very important point of clarification and development in terms of logical formation and systematic language, one second, it also has certain drawbacks, because the notion of divine illumination being more symbolic and metaphorical is on the one hand closer to the biblical witness, all of the instances of light, the liturgical witness, all of the instances of light, and how light, in a sense, is really a ground or a condition of intelligibility and meaningfulness throughout all creation. And on the other hand, the notion of divine illumination is in a certain way more flexible. And so you can do more things with it through different analogical uses of light that univocal being or the univocal concept of being doesn't allow for. And so there's a certain drawback with these developments. Like in any revolution or development, you lose some of the good in terms of the change that you had prior to the change, even if the change is in some way necessary. But I think we'll see that you can go back and forth between St. Bonaventure's account of divine illumination and Scotus's later refinement in the univocal concept of being. That's what we're hoping to show in the following weeks. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Brother Charles, what were you going to say? I would have to think about that, but there is a school of thought rooted in the Cambridge Anglican theologian called Radical Orthodoxy. I'm sure you've heard of it, and that is how they take Scotus, and they've run with this. In terms of a historical figure, I'm not sure, because really, say between the Dominicans and the Franciscans, up until the modern period, I don't think they misunderstood Scotus so much in terms of what he was doing with univocal being or the univocal concept of being. I think they more objected to the formulation of the univocal concept of being as such. They said this just doesn't work, because if you have a concept, there must imply some sort of common reality. But since Scotus denies that, some sort of common metaphysical reality, but since Scotus denies that, they say, you know, if there's no common metaphysical reality, how can you have a common conceptual reality? And so their objection more is actually more basic than say what the radical orthodoxy people would say today. So they don't even get that far. But you know, one practical effect of the radical orthodoxy approach is that it's gained quite a strong following in even Roman Catholic theology and Orthodox theology. For example, Bishop Robert Barron, I think he's an auxiliary bishop, quite a popular internet personality. He simply asserts in several of his works that Scotus held to this false and very pernicious notion of being that essentially asserted that God and creation are both subsequent to this transcendental being, and thus God and creature are really ultimately the same thing. And so he takes Scotus as affirming this, but clearly, looking at the text of Scotus, he doesn't affirm this. And we'll hope to get to this. Alex, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say. So you introduced the idea that there is not that many people assume there's no unity in the Franciscan school because of this disparity of terms or concepts through time and through the development of the schools, especially from Francis to Bonaventure. There's gap 1, and then Bonaventure to Scotus, gap 2. And then you said, but here's an example of where the terminology changed, and you talked about divine illumination changed to univocity. And I'm wondering if there's a list of 2 or 3 examples. You don't have to explain them all, but just other examples of that same idea of the disparity in terminology creating confusion about the unity of the tradition.
Right. Well, there are several examples that come to mind, and I'll try to enunciate them. Another example is the development in language or terminology between Bonaventure and Scotus with their speaking of and about the will. So Bonaventure uses the term synderesis, and it refers to the will's natural inclination for goodness. There's a natural inclination for the will to seek and be realized and fulfilled in good and in the ultimate good. Where Scotus changes the terminology and speaks of the will's orientation for goodness for its own sake in terms of the affectio justitiae.
Okay.
So that's an example of a terminological difference that people take to be a substantive difference. Let me think. There was another example that came to mind. It slipped my mind.
Okay.
But yes. Many people take Bonaventure's account of being and the notion of distinction, namely the real distinction, which implies separability between 2 items or real independence between 2 items. So by separable, meaning there's a real distinction, for example, between my soul and my body. They can be separated, right? That's a real distinction. And then on the other hand, a virtual distinction or a distinction of reason, which is saying that you really have one item, like a perfect red sphere, right? There's no distinction within the redness of the sphere itself. However, you can create a distinction of reason based upon your orientation to the ball between the front of the ball and the back of the ball. You're not affirming a real distinction necessarily between front and back on the one hand, because the relation of frontness and backness is purely accidental to the ball. And secondly, because it's a continuous surface, the red is continuous. I mean, you can't really make a distinction between it. So you create a virtual distinction in order to designate for yourself in order to help your own mind understand what you're talking about between the front and the back of the ball. So people say, okay, Scotus introduced an intermediate distinction, namely the formal distinction, the famous formal distinction. Again, kind of it's really the linchpin to understanding Scotus's doctrine of univocity. You have to have the formal distinction in order to explain univocity, right? But so people that say that this is a new thing, a radically new thing in Scotus, and therefore it's another point of departure from Saint Bonaventure, a kind of radical shift. But in reality, as even in my own book, published by the Academy of the Immaculate, and other scholars like Titus Jabot, Miguel Oromi, and other figures, they argue for the presence of the formal distinction in Bonaventure under the terms the differentia minima, which appears in the it appears and is used to quite good effect in the disputed questions on the knowledge of Christ, the disputed questions on the mystery of the Trinity, and again in the Breviloquium. And this is interesting because all three of these works, which we will be focusing on, except the Breviloquium, are quite early in Bonaventure's career, and he maintains a fairly consistent approach to these. Now, the formal distinction, let me just quickly define it, is the formal distinction is recognized by the mind a posteriorily. How do you like that? I adverbialized a Latin word. A posteriori means simply after or second to a prior effect. So what I'm saying here is the mind recognizes a distinction between two things that is objective. The thing itself or the things itself is or are presenting the distinction to the mind. The mind isn't coming up with it like the mind does in a virtual distinction or a distinction of reason, like the front and the back of a red ball, a perfect sphere. The difference between two entities present itself to the mind, and our recognition of the difference between or the distinction between the two entities derives from the thing itself. So that seems like a real distinction, but the rub here is that the formal distinction doesn't affirm that the two things under consideration are independent of one another or really separable from one another. So unlike the real distinction, the two items or the different items that are presented to the mind are not able to be separated, even though they are objectively presenting themselves to the mind as distinct. The mind isn't just coming up with this distinction. And so, very classic examples of the formal distinction that you find in the Franciscan school in Scotus are the distinctions, say, between God's justice and God's wisdom. Now, we know that because God is absolutely first being, there's nothing prior. There's nothing prior to God. God isn't participating in anything outside of God. So wisdom and justice can't, in this sense, be prior to God, that God takes into himself and is in a sense built up from or composed out of. Wisdom and justice simply are God because God is simple and infinite. But on the other hand, so if we affirm the unity of God, how do we avoid collapsing wisdom into justice or justice into wisdom? They're not simply the same thing because they have formally different definitions which derive from what Scotus would say objective or quitative differences in themselves. Justice is simply irreducible to wisdom. You see, so this affirms the distinction, but yet, on the other hand, it affirms the unity. So a formal distinction is simply objectively distinct items that present themselves to the mind that are nevertheless non-independent from one another and inseparable in reality from one another. Another example in the Franciscan school is the distinction between the will and the intellect, or the memory and the intellect and the will. You can't simply reduce the will, both in itself and in its operations, to the intellect, because the will's function and mode of activity is to love the good. And the intellect's mode of activity is to know the truth, right? So they have different functions. They have different operations that are irreducible to one another. But you can't separate the two a la a real distinction. You can't separate intellect from will and act as though the will can act and operate independently from the will, or the will can act independently and operate independently from the intellect. I may have said will twice on that last one. And so, on the one hand, there's a real identity in the human soul between the memory, intellect, and will, even though there's a formal distinction. And secondly, there's a real identity for the Franciscan school between the soul's powers, namely memory, intellect, and will, and the soul itself. Yet, because we note all these objective distinctions that are prior to our mind, then we have to recognize that these distinctions are objective. Our mind simply isn't making this up. Alex, you were going to say something?
Right. I was just wondering, clarification, is from my memory, and we don't have to spend any time on this, just clarification, is the corollary term for two things that are formally distinct radical identity?
Yes, that's right. Radical meaning that the things that are distinct are rooted in one thing, one entity, one mode of being.
So those two things are radically identical.
Yes, because they relate in a sense terminatively in, like, for example, God's wisdom and God's justice. You can think of them horizontally as distinct, between one another, but both of these are equally rooted and identical ontologically with the one divine being. Does that make sense? That's by radical.
Right.
Literally the Latin word radix, rooted.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Good.
Does this make sense to the friars at all? I mean, this is kind of a fire hose initially, but it's laying out some differences and developments. I don't see anyone from New York scratching his head, but that's because there's no video feed. So, okay. I had a couple of other examples in mind, but that are key apparent differences between St. Bonaventure and Scotus. However, were you going to say something, brother? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I know that. Thank you. That's a great suggestion. I don't know. I think I have. I have a copy of this I can send around, so you can see these tables of convergences. Here, I'll just hold it up to them. Here's the first. Can you read that? Oh, sorry.
Perhaps if you hold still. Not quite. It's kind of blurry.
Well, here, I'll send it out, but then you can see kind of what it's going to be.
Good.
All right. So, yeah, that's a good. Thank you for recommending that. So our point is, though, is to see that there's a basic unity of thought. However, on the other hand, we want to recognize there is a true development that takes place. Let's see here. Another point is this seminar is going to be rooted more in getting a grasp of Franciscan philosophy. Now, this presents a certain difficulty, especially in the thought of St. Bonaventure, because St. Bonaventure, both in terms of his writing and in terms of his methodology, and I think in terms of his theoretical position, although he distinguishes between theology and philosophy, they're always sort of perichoretically in processing, meaning they're kind of living in one another. You don't have a philosophical treatise from St. Bonaventure, and in so many instances, his philosophical insights are embedded in and within the context of theological works. And so this presents a certain difficulty because ultimately the Franciscan tradition, although recognizing the distinction between faith and reason, between theology and philosophy, there's a kind of concreteness in the Franciscan tradition that reflects first upon what actually exists and reflects first upon what actually exists in terms of God's good pleasure. or what God willed to do. And as we will discover, and as I'm sure you all already know, the best name that we can have for God comes from 1 John's epistle. The first epistle of John, excuse me, and it's God is love. God is love. And so whatever he does is motivated by love. And whatever God does motivated by love outside of himself is not necessary. But yet, if it's not necessary, how does this relate to what actually is? Well, what actually is or exists in the created order was created for the sake of Christ in the incarnation in a Marian mode. And there's much more that can be said about this, but the point of this simply is that everything we have to say about nature, the natural created order, is situated teleologically or purposively in terms of the incarnation through Mary and the building up or completing of the body of Christ, which is the church. So that everyone in this communion is in a perfect loving relationship with God, and thereby in a loving relationship with one another in a resurrected mode of existence. So this really colors then how we approach metaphysics and questions of natural theology, because we already know the end of the story. We already know how all of these natural dynamisms and teleologies considered abstractly, how they're meant or how they were intentionally ordered from the beginning, from eternity in God. And so this really does color and affect the way we approach Franciscan philosophy, because Franciscan philosophy is always concretely embedded in the one existence of the one unique created order for the sake of Jesus and Mary and the church. Does that make sense? So go ahead. That's a good point. That's a very good point. It is related to that insofar as the real distinction between essence and existence in Thomas seems to imply the possibility deriving from Aristotle of eternally independent forms or species that God does not create, on the one hand. So it seems to undermine God's freedom to act, and on the one hand, because these eternal forms always existed from not from any kind of good diffusing of itself freely, but rather from a kind of necessary emanation from the first mover's superfluity of being. But the first mover doesn't even have really any idea that these forms exist. They just exist because of his being. And so on the one hand, he can't know us, and on the other hand, we can't really relate to him because he's so great, he just thinks about himself. I mean, that's the famous Aristotelian axiom, thought thinking itself. And then on the other hand, so if it undermines contingency, on the other hand, it also affects the way we analyze being or existence and essence. Because for St. Thomas, especially interpreted by modern philosophers like Etienne Gilson, for Thomas, God is simply being, pure being, and really his essence is simply his existence, right? And created beings are a combination within a real separability between an essence and their existence. But where with Etienne Gilson's interpretation of St. Thomas and this real distinction between essence and existence, or being and essence, the important insight of this for Gilson is that Thomas, by making a real distinction between essence and existence, is preserving the created world from being God himself. Because for Etienne Gilson, any notion of essence is inherently circumscribing or limiting. That means if you have an essence, then you are a limited being. But if you and if it were really identical, this essence with your being, well, then you would have the same being as God has being, because God has no essence other than his existence. And so there must be a real separability between essence and existence for there to be contingent beings and finite beings. Does that make sense? Are you following that? And so it's related down the road to the problem, but it's not immediately connected. Going on then, let's look at the methodology of the course. In terms of methodology, there are some difficulties in coming to the study of Franciscan philosophy. First of all, because Franciscan philosophy is oftentimes so embedded, especially in St. Bonaventure, in theological texts and contexts. So that's one difficulty. A second difficulty is that with Scotus, a lot of his theological, or rather philosophical insights come within the context of pages upon pages of very difficult Latin text, and when translated, very difficult English text. So it would present problems to have a group reading of Scotus that is just simply a running or continuous read of various texts. And so what I've decided to do then, and this you can see on the second page in the methodology section of the syllabus, what I've decided to do is, in the first section, spend 10 weeks or so on St. Bonaventure reading primary texts, because they have good English translations and they're fairly succinct, the texts we're looking at. So they're manageable. They're the longest one I think is about 100 pages that we're going to look at. And it's presented very well in an English translation. With Scotus, however, because of the nature of his texts and how they're in a sense so meandering, in a good way, but he will go pages and pages and pages, stating a premise on page 1 and then stating another premise on page 6 or 7, and then drawing a conclusion or presenting his own position on page 25. And so you've really got to work in order to follow his line of reasoning. And he's so thorough and complete in presenting all the possible objections against a position he's going to take, and presenting all of the possible arguments in favor of the position he's going to take. And then in terms of his own responses to the objections, his own articulations of premises that he's bringing to his argument. And then finally, you might get to his own conclusion or his own response. But this is a very diffuse approach. It's very thorough, but as Father Peter says so often, Scotus in itself, reading Scotus in himself, proves that there is a form of intellectual asceticism. And really that's the mindset, one should take when approaching Scotus, because his texts are so difficult. And so what we're going to do in this section on Scotus then is I've taken the outline of a very classic but yet fairly recent Scotistic manual by Parthenius Mingus, and I've divided the Scotus section up topically. But because I don't want you simply reading secondary literature, articles, books, we will have that. What I'm doing for the Scotus section is following out the outline that Mingus presents, because this will allow us to get a coherent picture of how the different pieces of Scotus's philosophy fit together in a logical, systematic way, whereas in his actual text, they're not presented systematically. They're presented along the outlines of Peter Lombard's sentences, or along the outlines of Aristotle's commentary, or Aristotle's books, say on the metaphysics, or on the soul, or on the physics. You have all of these different commentaries that Scotus wrote, but he's not writing on his own program. And dying at the age of 42 or 43, he was never able to complete his systematic presentation. So that was left to his disciples. And so what we've done then is we've taken Mingus's outline of his philosophical itinerary or presentation. And then what I'm going to do is take the old, let me see. I'll show you. You probably have a copy. Is I'm taking this, the Promptuarium Scoticum by Cardinal Charles de Varese published in the 1600s, and this was edited, or at least Father Peter wrote the foreword back in, I don't know, 2005 or 6. What that is, though, is it simply is a source book of passages from Scotus that are organized according to a dictionary format. So they take the concept of being, of will, and what it does is it gathers together long passages or paragraphs from Scotus's own texts and then lays them out in a linear systematic fashion. And so what I'm doing then is I'm populating this section of the course in addition to having you look at Copleston, in addition to having you look at Richard Cross, in addition to having you look at the big book on Duns Scotus's philosophy by Anthony Voss. These are all things you don't have to worry too much about. They're just things to look at alongside. What I'm doing is I'm going to translate all of these texts and have them in what I call the Scotistic catena, or catena of Scotistic quotations. So you'll have all of the primary texts in front of you in a systematic format, so that you have the choice quotations, the choice conclusions and arguments, without having to wade through 50 pages of a distinction or a question in the sentence commentary or the ordinatio. Does that make sense? So it's a methodological shift, but I don't see it. I don't really see any other good solution, because I don't want to just rely on secondary literature. I want you to actually read the words of Scotus. But on the other hand, Scotus, in the greater bulk of his writing, is nothing like St. Bonaventure or St. Thomas. His writing is very difficult. And I think, just as an aside, Saint Bonaventure's writing is as a literary masterpiece. I mean, one should always try to read his work in Latin when one gets the facility, because he's just a beautiful, straightforward, clear author, but he's also a literary artist. Every one of his works are literarily works of great beauty and art. Scotus, on the other hand, because he was so often so many of his lectures were reportationes, meaning reported or recorded speeches from lectures that Scotus gave on the fly. They have this kind of, again, diffusive and meandering quality. Scotus is thinking, well, yes, the object of the will is the good, and the will does act of its own accord. It's not informed by any other cause. It's not a natural cause like the intellect is. And yes, intellect itself, though, has for its object truth. And truth is a transcendental, related, or ultimately rooted in the unity of a being. And so then the unity, truth, and goodness are convertible. But this gets us back to the will. And the will then operates of its own accord spontaneously, unlike the intellect, in order to seek the good, where the object of the intellect and the act of the intellect is to seek the truth. You see, there's a progression there, but he's constantly going back and forth. It's like speech. It's like a conversation. And because the level of his internal conversation was so much higher than most anyone else's, if you're reading it in Latin, it makes for a difficult chore. Plus, and this is something Father Peter brought up many times, is Scotus's first language was probably some dialect of Southern Scottish or Northern English. So he's speaking some language or thinking in some language and then translating it into Latin. Whereas with St. Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas, they clearly were absolute masters of Latin and thought in perfect classical medieval Latin form. Whereas Scotus's syntax and the progression of his thought is definitely more Anglo or Celtic. It's just much more linear and diffusive rather than very compact, tight, and very, very well self-contained in small, clear, concise packages. And then finally, in the third section of the class, what I hope to do is, by presenting the readings of St. Bonaventure, by discussing those and then moving through Scotus and getting a kind of overarching architectonic picture of Scotus's philosophy, we'll move into some primary writings of Father Peter. And while it can be said, Father, other thinkers or other theological and philosophical masters said many things, or at least certain things more clearly and more concisely than Father Peter, I do think the more I work with his texts, the more I meditate upon his texts and think about them, I am becoming more and more convinced that even if other people have said things a little more clearly, a little more concisely, a little more artistically, I think nobody has reached the profundity, on the one hand, of the unity of the Franciscan tradition through its major figures, St. Francis, St. Bonaventure, Scotus, Maximilian Kolbe. No one has attained the depth of understanding as he has. And of course, he's a brilliant holy man, and he comes at the end of a long string of brilliant holy theologians. So he has somewhat of an advantage there. And so and also in terms of his synthetic, harmonious presentation of the various facets of the insights and language of St. Bonaventure, working in perfect concert with the insights and language of Scotus and Kolbe. No one else has really achieved this. And so hopefully after we've moved through Bonaventure, after we've moved through Scotus, Father Peter will shed a retrojective light on the one hand back on the insights of the Franciscan school, while on the other hand, he presents a synthesis that can truly move forward because it's radically modulated through the insights into the Immaculate Conception and the co-redemption and mediatrix of all graces. Father Peter actually is able to formulate a philosophy in terms of these insights that provide the master key of the entire Franciscan tradition, namely the primacy of charity, the primacy of Christ in a Marian mode. He's able to, in a sense, recapitulate and organize metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and theology into a Marian key, which is perfect because the Franciscan tradition emphasizes the concrete realities. It reasons from concrete realities, from facts, and builds up a speculative system from that. Well, the most concrete reality or facts are persons. And the most concrete persons are divine persons or human persons perfectly divinized. Well, who do we have? We have our Lord himself, a divine person, and our Lady, Mary, as the Holy Theotokos and Immaculate Conception, perfectly divinized person, perfectly filled with grace. And so in this sense, then, it provides a master key of organizing and synthesizing the entire Franciscan tradition, moving from the past to the present, but also moving through the present into the future, bringing forth the prophecy of Our Lady of Fatima. In the end, her Immaculate Heart will triumph. And St. Maximilian Kolbe, the incorporation of the Immaculate Conception into the entire life of the Church. And thus, the object for our hope as Christians, and really the only grounds for ecumenical dialogue and resolution and interreligious dialogue and resolution is through the recognition of those two mysteries of the Incarnation, but especially the Incarnation in a Marian Immaculate mode. And so the last weeks we'll be spending some time looking at Father Peter and hopefully providing a kind of master key or a capstone to these two earlier steps at looking at Bonaventure and Scotus. Another thing to mention is, as with St. Bonaventure himself in his writings, Bonaventure repeats himself a lot. Scotus repeats himself a lot, but Bonaventure is in a sense notorious for repeating himself. But what people sometimes miss is that in the repetitions, there's a further recapitulation, meaning he's bringing forward the same topics and presenting them in a deeper, more developed light or in a different context. And so what I hope to do, I hope will happen or naturally flow out of my little spiels at the beginning of our meeting periods, and then also flow naturally from our conversation on the basis flowing out of the texts, is that these themes, central themes, will be repeated and recapitulated throughout the course, always providing greater clarity. So we'll bring forth a theme on the primacy of the will from Bonaventure, and then discuss this theme again in relation to Scotus. And then when we're discussing Scotus, we're looking back to Bonaventure and saying, how these insights are rooted in the same reality how Bonaventure's thought is so seminal, and on the other hand, how Scotus is developing and bringing new insights into Bonaventure's own thoughts through these new contexts and insights of Scotus, and so on and so forth. And so, as we discuss key Franciscan notions of recapitulation, which is a key philosophical and theological both method and concept in the Franciscan tradition, we're actually going to be doing it. And so we'll see recapitulation in operation on the intellectual and hopefully spiritual levels as we go through this course. Okay, now let's see where we're at. It's 7:13. Let's go really quick then through the key themes in Franciscan philosophy on page 3 of the syllabus. This is perhaps a useful chart that you can... Go ahead, Alex.
I'm sorry, just wanted a couple questions about the syllabus in the order that you were presenting there. You didn't mention Newman. I wanted to know if you wanted to say how that fits in, because that's on the syllabus. And then, is there going to be any time period? This is just something maybe I'm interested in, or maybe it'll just come up sort of organically in class. But the contrast of the Franciscan way of looking at things with the Thomistic or Dominican way of looking at things.
I hadn't really thought of that. On the one hand, I was thinking there would be so much time and energy taken up in presenting the Franciscan position positively that there might be less time for contrast with the Dominican position. But I'm very, very happy to engage in a kind of sniping / apologetic endeavor against the enemies from the order of the preachers. That's all tongue in cheek. And I can say that because I'm just a lowly layman and I have no stake, so nobody can come get me for saying nasty things. But I think that would be enjoyable. What I would like then is, because I might tend to swallow up too much time in contrasting and lose the overall thread of presentation. I would be very happy to, in the course of our discussion, maybe after the first half an hour, 45 minutes, when I'm blabbing on, people raise questions, because I might not think of all of those pertinent issues that are real life, real time issues for all you people in your day-to-day studies or teaching. It's just, I'm not thinking of that very much anymore, but I'm happy to address that, and I think that's very important.
So we're just to be clear for how we're going to operate in terms of the seminar. Yeah. So you want to talk for maybe 45 minutes or a half hour, and then you're going to give us the time for questions. So we should be on our notes keeping track of the questions so that we can ask you.
That's right. Questions. And I'm very happy for interjections. Okay. I'm just planning on taking about 30 to 45 minutes to say what I think are the key ideas, key themes, brief summary of the readings, and then I'm hoping to move into greater depth through questions, through clarifications that need to come from you guys. Because I won't have the questions arising that you will. Because, some of these things are quite familiar to me and they just seem normal. Whereas with new readers, they might seem strange. And I might not pick that up. So yeah, I will get to the actual format of the seminars in just 1 second. But to address your question about Newman, the reason he's included is, in the first sense, materially, Father Peter wrote a very interesting and insightful and perhaps even controversial study, or essay rather, comparing Scotus's thought and really recapitulating Bonaventure through Scotus's thought to Newman's thought. And it's Father Peter's contention, and I think it's well justified in his essay, that there are many correlations in the epistemology, ethics, and metaphysics of Scotus and Newman that renders them very, very good dialogue partners on the one hand, and also provides certain advantages for those reading Scotus or those reading Newman. If you read them together, they're mutually illuminating. Moreover, Newman has a great deal of influence in the church today, and he writes in very good English. And so while Scotus's insights are very difficult to convey or to communicate, Newman presents many of the same insights in English on the one hand, and Newman, while he has many insights into especially the nature of belief, see you later, Jeremy, on the nature of belief and religious faith, Newman could do with dialoguing with Scotus, because Scotus provides explicitly many of the metaphysical conditions for rendering Newman's account rational and coherent. Does that make sense? And so Father Peter advanced a new thesis, really quite new. It's not entirely new, as he points out, but he advances a thesis that Scotus and Newman are quite compatible, and Newman presents certain developments on Scotus that are important, while Scotus provides certain metaphysical concepts and foundations that are very helpful to preserving Newman from a kind of fideism or nominalism. Many people take Newman metaphysically to be a nominalist. Even someone like Tim Newman takes Newman to be a nominalist. And so Father Peter, by appeal to the metaphysics of Scotus, justifying textually and, in a sense, conceptually, the continuity between Scotus and Newman, is able to say, there's some interesting things happening here. This is a worthwhile comparison. So then, before moving on then to the key themes in the Franciscan philosophy, it would probably be helpful to discuss how I'm imagining the seminar to go. I'm imagining the seminar in the first section to deal with me giving a spiel on things that come to mind with respect to the texts and how those texts relate to broader themes. I hope to hit 3 or 4 main points during this time of our seminar. In the second part, after I give my spiel, there's a twofold possibility. One, you can simply respond to the lecture, or you can respond to the lecture in terms of the readings, bring forward questions. But I'm anticipating the second part to just be direct responses to what I'm saying. Okay, and then a third part, maybe the second hour, if we plan to go 2 hours, which I think is what we're going to do. The second hour will be given over to a discussion of the texts. And so what I'm imagining is each one of you coming prepared with insights or key themes that you came away from the readings with, and you discussing that, bringing that forward, and then there being a kind of give and take between the group, which I will facilitate and try to guide and direct. And then at the end, maybe some general comments on how these things fit together. Because what I want to have is I want to have both a presentation that's guiding the discussion, getting what I think are the key points in order to have a coherent overall view of the Franciscan tradition. But I also want you guys actively engaging, taking responsibility, and putting forth your own thoughts or own readings on the text, and perhaps being challenged, shot down, clarified, in a very friendly manner. And then what does that leave us for the kind of discussion and comparison in contrast with St. Thomas and the Thomistic approach? Well, I don't know if that will leave us much time, but hopefully in the course of discussion based upon the readings, certain ideas or contrasts or tensions will come to mind just from the readings. And then, of course, there always is the possibility of simply raising your hand and saying, hey, I have a question about this. So does that make sense to everyone? Yeah. Okay. Then what we can do now is just simply look at the key themes in Franciscan philosophy. And this is actually a very helpful list that one can take in terms of beginning reflection on the Franciscan tradition, and also thinking about the Franciscan tradition in terms of reading or research, because these are several key differences. And the first most obvious one is the intimate union of philosophy and theology. This is simply because of the way that the Franciscan school conceives of the relationship between nature and grace based upon the one concrete reality. Whereas the Dominicans or the Thomistic approach will emphasize separation and independence between the orders of nature and supernature, the Franciscan tradition, while recognizing distinction and integrity of creation and grace, nature, supernature, they will tend to explain the entire process in terms of an order based upon God's good pleasure, an order where everything that God has done is ultimately for the sake of salvation. Salvation in and through Christ and the church. Another key area, and we can read these ourselves, you can read them yourselves after the lecture, substantial identity of the soul and its faculties. This is very clearly different from an Aristotelian account, because an Aristotelian account affirms both a real distinction, meaning a kind of independence, a real distinction between the soul and its faculties, and between the faculties themselves. Whereas the Franciscan school says, no, there's a real identity, and so it explains these in terms of a formal distinction. Well, this will affect how you conceive of grace, how you conceive of the operation of the soul with respect to knowledge and with respect to love. This will have profound effects on how you view these things. Another important area is the substantial union between soul and body. For St. Thomas, following Aristotle, any kind of entity that is made up of two distinct principles, that is any type of composed being, there's always and only one formal principle, meaning there's only one energy or force that explains what that one being is. So, for example, you can talk about a dog. A dog is composed of matter and form. Matter being the physical stuff that the dog is made of, and form being that energy or force which causes this physical stuff to be organized and act and function in a dog-like manner. But there's only one form. There's the form of dogness. And that's it. There are no other forms. There's not the form of dogness, and maybe if the dog dies and there's still a dog-looking body, a form of dog bodiliness. And so you have a multiplicity of forms that function or operate in order to explain physical phenomena. So for St. Thomas, when a dog dies, that body is no longer a dog. It just appears to be a dog. It's informed by some other form that we can't identify. You see, and this has important consequences for theology in terms of the Christ's state, the body of Christ in the tomb from Good Friday to Easter morning. Was that a human body because it lacked a human soul? Well, for St. Thomas, he'd have a hard time explaining how it was a human body. Another important area would be in philosophy and medicine. It's very difficult, according to St. Thomas's account, to explain, say, a heart transplant. Because once the heart is separated from the body, it's separated from the form that makes that body and thereby that heart to be a human heart. So in the interim, the heart ceases to be a heart and begins to be something else. And then upon its insertion and reattachment and rebooting in another body, it becomes a heart again. And so it's difficult to explain the continuity, the real continuity, in some sort of operation like a heart transplant, many medical procedures. Alex, it looked like you were going to say something.
No.
Okay. Whereas with the Franciscan school, and this is related to the substantial union between soul and body, but the greater autonomy of soul with respect to body, is the Franciscan school affirms several things. It affirms a real unity, but it doesn't explain the unity in terms of one form alone. It has many possible forms in one unity that can explain different manifestations or stages of that unity's life. So with say, a human being, when a human being dies, the spiritual soul leaves the body, right? But the body still seems to exist like a body. It's just not animate anymore. And so Scotus especially will posit, in order to explain this intermediate state between a living body and a decomposed body, there's some form that explains why the body doesn't just simply decompose immediately. And he calls that the forma corporeitatis, or the form of the body. And so what you find here is, instead of one form, namely the human soul being the sole explanation of the total being, body and soul, of one person, you have many forms, a plurality of forms. So it's the doctrine of the plurality of forms. That's important. Secondly, in this plurality of forms, the Franciscan school also recognizes partial or incomplete forms. And we can talk about this a little bit later, because that's a little bit more complex. How do you have a partial form? Well, by a partial form, meaning the form isn't fully in act apart from some other reality that causes it to exist in a real, coherent, and integral manner. And then finally, the Franciscan school, unlike the Dominican school, affirms a plurality of substances. And this is really difficult for a Dominican to wrap their head around, because for a Dominican, any compound being is simply one substance or one reality by virtue of it being the compound of one sole form and one sole matter. Whereas St. Bonaventure says, no, you can have two substances in one compound form, but those substances are incomplete. So you have act and potency, a certain kind of matter or principle of change in the soul, and a form in the soul that causes the soul to act and to change. And you also have act and potency with the body. The body's more obvious. The body's clearly material, but it's in potency, or it's capable of being acted upon by the soul. But because when the soul leaves the body doesn't just simply cease to exist. The body must have some act or explaining principle of its own. So it has the form of the body. But what you have then is you have two partial substances, body and soul, that must be together, or must be existing in reality together, for you to have a complete substance. So that's another area that the Franciscans and the Dominicans part ways on. The Dominicans have an easier time explaining the unity of any given thing, because they just say there's one form and one matter. So it's very unified. One substantial form for any one substance. But they have a harder time explaining some of these riddles, such as Christ's time in the tomb, the body of Christ's time in the tomb, medical procedures such as transplantation, medical realities such as brain death or heart cessation, and a revivification of that body. Is it the same body? What happened to the body when the body stopped functioning and was restarted? Some of these matters, and it also has some difficulty explaining the relationship or distinctness of the soul that's very clear in the patristic tradition, especially St. Augustine, from the body. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both sides of the whatever position you take. Any questions? I don't want to belabor all these issues. I think you can read through these and see these are all talking points. And I could just go on and on with each one of these. Go ahead.
Jared, this is Father Lewis at Mount St. Francis. I finally made it back. I just wonder if you could, forgive me maybe for asking you to expound upon what is a basic philosophical principle, but just at least for the benefit of some of the students here at the postures at Mount St. Francis. Can you expound a little bit on this difference between the real distinction and the emphasis of the Franciscans on the formal distinction, and what difference that makes?
Okay. We did talk a little bit about it in the beginning. Basically, St. Thomas and Aristotle before him recognized two kinds of distinctions. One was a real distinction, and the other was a distinction of reason. So real in this sense, refers to the fact that the items that are distinct prior to the mind's operation and independent of the mind's operation, meaning the mind doesn't make these things distinct. They're distinct regardless of the mind knowing them, the human intellect knowing them. So that presents the real or objective basis of making or recognizing such a distinction. A corollary aspect of the real distinction is the assertion that the items distinguished are really separate or able to be truly separated, or, in the case of the Trinity, independent. And the Trinity seems to be almost a unique type of example, because clearly we affirm a real distinction between the persons of the Trinity. Of course, they're not in any way separable, either from each other or from the divine essence. So we say that the real distinction in the persons of the Trinity has to do with their modes of origination. The Father is absolutely unoriginate. The Son originates via a natural causality, the will, the operation of the divine intellect, and the Spirit originates via the operation of the divine will. But again, all of the three persons are really identical to the divine being, but yet the real distinction then is created through the fact that they originate according to different modes and terminate in relations that are opposed. And in this termination of relations that are opposed, you recognize that each person is independent of the other person insofar as each person is fully God, and no other person makes a divine person be God in terms of essence. Because for the divine essence to be made or to be perfected is already implying that the divine essence is imperfect. And so with the Trinity, there's independence is asserted, but not real separability in the sense of a distinction, a real distinction in the physical order. So now a distinction of reason is simply a distinction that the mind imposes upon a thing in order for the mind to understand various aspects of one given thing, in order to help the mind come to a better, fuller understanding of that thing that he's considering. So you could consider the head of a hammer. Obviously, the head of a hammer has a certain shape. It has the cat's paw. It has the face. It's not really separable as a head of a hammer. I mean, clearly you could use physical force and break the hammer in pieces. It's not an absolute essence. But as a head of a hammer, it's hard to separate. Say you could the face of the hammer from the striking surface of the hammer. You see, the face of the hammer and the striking surface of the hammer. You can consider the hammer as a face, and you can consider the hammer as a striking surface. So that's a virtual distinction your mind raises to look at an aspect of the hammer under different considerations to understand different facets of the hammer to increase understanding. And so it's not a distinction that's really in the thing. It's a distinction the mind brings to the thing in order to gain a certain insight or a certain point of view on the thing under consideration. So do we have these two, these kind of the poles of the real and real distinction and the distinction of reason clear enough? Does that make sense? Brother Charles? You're correct, and the reason why Scotus responded to the separability criterion, because you all have to realize that between Thomas and Bonaventure and Scotus, there were 25 or 30 years of some of the most the most, what should I say, most radical advancements in philosophical discourse. The level of development that occurred, say, between Anselm and Abelard to Aquinas and Bonaventure was great. But it was more of a continuum, kind of keeping the same themes and developing out of this one common conception, new insights, and pushing the envelope. But moving from Thomas and Bonaventure to Scotus, there were what you might be able to call quantum leaps, qualitative leaps in terms of modes of expression and the use of logic. And thus, with the use of logic and these different modes of expression, different possible metaphysical insights and ways to articulate. Now, what it ended up doing is it ended up shaving off some of the florid or more beautiful elements of the medieval synthesis that you find in St. Thomas or St. Bonaventure, more of the poetic, symbolic modes of expression, ambiguity in expression. Some people love ambiguity. This is, this is being recorded, forgive me. But, I find so many Thomists, because St. Thomas isn't clear about what he's saying, they confuse these mystifications or ambiguities in language with mysticism itself. They just rapturize over ambiguities in the language, and they forget, no, the language is actually supposed to refer to something. And so with Scotus, I think because the language is rendered much more precise, and in a sense you end up cutting off some of the beautiful aspects of, but less clear aspects of the preceding tradition, you really can locate the mystery in the Trinity or the Incarnation rather than philosophical and theologically ambiguous formulations about the mystery of the Trinity and the Incarnation. And so that's an important point. But getting back to your central question, between Aquinas and Bonaventure and Scotus, on the question of the real distinction, you're right. The real distinction was reduced by the person of Giles of Rome, or Gilles of Rome, to the separability criterion. And Scotus was directly responding to this. So he had to posit a formal distinction to say, wait a second, you can have objective distinction in a being without this being or the two beings that are under consideration, or three beings or four, whatever, under consideration being really separable, meaning able to subsist independently or separately, or that these two beings under consideration are really independent, function in absolute isolation or autonomy from the other entity that it's being compared to. So in St. Thomas, he seems to have, under the real distinction, a species of the separability criterion as the real distinction, and then there's a more ambiguously formulated real distinction that doesn't affirm the separability that came later with Giles of Rome. And I have to rehearse the particular of this distinction within St. Thomas with respect to the second mode of a real distinction that seems to tend towards Scotus's formal distinction. Alex, what were you going to say, Alex?
So is the distinction between triangularity and trilaterality, is that a formal distinction?
Yeah.
Because you can't have one without the other, but they're all different in meaning.
Sometimes it's hard to distinguish whether or not. I think triangularity and trilaterality would be a formal distinction because it's emphasizing two different aspects of one entity, but the one entity are really inseparable, because with triangularity you're specifying angle, and trilaterality you're specifying the sides, and so they're inseparable, but they're actually objectively distinct in a triangle.
Right.
So yeah, that's a good example.
And that isn't an example of a real distinction of where the two items are independent, as in the Trinity, because as you clarified, you seem to say that with the independence you mentioned in the Trinity, it's independent functionality.
Well, it's hard to specify quickly even what the independence is referring to with respect to the Trinity, because obviously each person is always functioning in and through the one divine essence, which is absolutely common to the three persons. So the independence really has to do with just the fact of a termination of the divine being that is distinct from another termination of the divine being. And so even though, so the only time that you can say that the three persons operate qua person distinctly is eternally in the Godhead. And that's the Latin word circumincession, or perikoresis in Greek. And this is affirming that the Father is the principle of generation and spiration of the Son and the Spirit, qua Father, but the Father is always acting through the divine essence. So once the Father generates the Son through an act of intellection, the act of intellection itself, because it's divine, and sorry, this is head exploding, I don't even know what it means, is once the Father acts via intellection, because this intellection itself, as a formal perfection of the divine being, is infinite, the term of this act of intellection will also be infinite. So it will be a termination of an infinite being, but because it's a real termination, you then end up with two persons, Father, Son, and so forth with the Spirit. But clearly, what the comment of Brother Charles is raising is the fact that St. Thomas realized that there's a problem of limiting the real distinction to the separability criterion, because then you'd end up having to deny the real distinction of persons in the Godhead. Because, in fact, the persons of the Godhead are absolutely inseparable from one another or from the divine being. Let's see. Are there any other observations or questions?
So maybe you don't have to go into this because you were just talking about it, but why aren't the members of the Trinity formally distinct?
Why aren't the members of the Trinity formally distinct?
Yeah.
Is that what your question is? It's because because it has to do with the fact that the divine being itself is infinite and perfect in itself. And in the act of intellection, according to Aristotle and according to Bonaventure and Scotus, is a mode of generation. But because the mode of generation itself doesn't imply imperfection on the one hand, you're not losing anything, and because the divine essence itself is perfect, if you have a mode of generation that is perfect and infinite, in the very act of generating, it won't terminate in something that is merely formally distinct, because the term itself is an absolutely distinct term of that action. And it's built right into the understanding of the fact that intellect and will are modes of generation. So if you have a mode of generation and the mode of generation is infinite, well, then the term itself will be infinite in essence, but distinct in terms. And so by that fact, the communication of the divine being from Father to Son is a communication of the being itself from one term to another term while remaining the same being. So that's why they're not formally distinct. It's because the communication itself is infinite. Whereas you can have a communication, say, imagine a communication between the love of God and the knowledge of God. Well, obviously God loves everything he knows, and he can't love what he doesn't know. But since he knows everything, he loves everything that is good and worthy of love. So clearly there's a kind of communication between God's intellect and will, but because God's intellect and will in this aspect are not coextensive definitionally with his essence, there's only a formal distinction because they don't terminate into really distinct beings. Does that make sense? No? Let's see here. Yes, I would suggest just once we, for next week, looking down these key themes themes that make Franciscan philosophy distinct, because they will give you a set of talking points, a set of launching points to enter into our reading of the texts of St. Bonaventure and Blessed Duns Scotus. Before we get too far, before we forget, because I think we're going to run out of time here, is I want to mention next week what we're going to read is on the reduction of the arts to theology. Oh boy, forgive me. If you see the syllabus, I say science. It's the reduction of the arts to science, to theology. And what this does is it actually is very important because it provides both in operation an actual moving example of Bonaventure's theory of reduction, which encompasses his entire philosophical and theological theory, and it shows it in act. So he's saying this is what we're doing, and we're actually doing it while we're describing what we're doing. So that's an important thing because you see an example of it, how it actually works, but you also see that, oh, this is a key point in all of Bonaventure's thought, order and reduction. And secondly, this is important too, because it lays out for our philosophical appetites how Bonaventure conceives of the various disciplines in philosophy, how they're broken down, how they're related, and how philosophy relates to theology, ultimately what Bonaventure says, sacred scripture. Because really for Bonaventure, his ultimate point is to know scripture, comment on scripture in a coherent and apostolic way so that we can live scripture. So this is a great text. It's only about 8 pages in the critical edition, I think 20 or 25, and I'm assuming we all have this. Is that right? Go ahead. I didn't understand what you said. Oh. And I can email it to the rest of the people in the class. That'd be great.
That's great.
Yeah, that's excellent. Okay, so we'll look at that, and then I will just crib some selections from the Collations and Hexameron that, in a sense, solidify and give an indication of what Bonaventure's central philosophical commitments and insights are. And then what you might look at, if you can, is the essay, the PDF of the essay, Bonaventure's Philosophical Method by Christopher Cullen. It's kind of a lengthy article, but it's well worth reading. I think in certain points he doesn't see as deeply as he could, but he's a philosopher coming from that perspective. But he does a good job in articulating Bonaventure's fundamental principles with respect to the relation between philosophy and theology, and he uses this word of heteronomy. So he affirms that Bonaventure says that philosophy has its own principles, in a certain way its own starting points, but philosophy can't simply be severed from theological inquiry, because once we understand theology, we understand that philosophy, for it to begin, either in terms of our theory of knowledge, or our theory of being, or of physical things in nature, it's already dependent upon the creative activity of the Trinity. So philosophy presupposes objectively the Trinity for knowing and being, and ultimately philosophy through metaphysics terminates in a conception of what? What's the best thing metaphysics, the highest thing metaphysics can give us? A concept of God, an existence of God. But yet this God happens to also be the Trinity. And so philosophy then runs through its entire course and terminates again where it began. Terminates where it began, the Trinity. And it moves throughout this entire course through the incarnation, and really what the incarnation brings to bear in terms of our not just knowing God, knowing the Trinity, but actually entering into a certain way of life in the Trinity through charity. So it's an important topic and an interesting topic, and I think hopefully it'll be helpful. Go ahead, Alex.
Are the other PDFs, are you going to send the other PDFs of the secondary sources?
Yeah, I was thinking, yeah, I'm going to.
Okay.
I'm going to send those probably tonight. The Cullen Semiotic Metaphysics and the Quinn. I have PDFs of both of those. We won't be reading the Quinn because it's about 800 or 900 pages long, but it's a good resource. Okay. I think in many ways Quinn makes mistakes, just irritating mistakes throughout his book. He was trained at the Pontifical University Medieval Institute at the University of Toronto under Etienne Gilson and in that school. So he has certain presuppositions, biases that make it difficult for him to fully appreciate the subtlety of Bonaventure's thought, but it's still a very important, handy reference work to have. For example, just one example, Cullen, towards the end of his, not Cullen, but Quinn, towards the end of his work, states that Bonaventure did not affirm the plurality of the forms. But this is patently false. And you only have to open up the Collations and Hexameron, where he explicitly affirms the plurality of the forms. It's just a blatant and direct contradiction. And so in certain ways, he's a bit irritating, frustrating, or infuriating, but he's also a great source because he deals with the background, almost every facet of Bonaventure's philosophical thought. Sometimes he doesn't do it as skillfully as you would hope. And then also, I've kind of filled up our airtime with me talking. But are there any questions or observations from the Bettoni reading? I'll begin with one. Is the Bettoni reading, sadly, is really, really helpful in providing an approach, a presentation of the integral continuity between St. Francis, St. Bonaventure, and Scotus. But you know what it's fairly light on? It's light on the Immaculate Theotokos. How do you have a presentation of Franciscan philosophy and theology without really understanding or stating where Our Lady comes in? Because obviously she's the central pivotal figure between the Trinity and the God-man and everything else. So that's one observation that I think is quite negative. But any other comments or questions from you guys?
Jared, Father Lewis here, Mount St. Francis. Mm-hmm. I brought this up with the community. It's kind of interesting you just made that comment. And I almost wasn't going to raise the observation because I haven't had a chance to go through the whole work yet. But there was a statement by Bettoni toward the beginning of the work where he mentioned that he is going to, he and Bettoni obviously himself is well versed in Scotus, but he mentions that he he says, I deem it more opportune, practically speaking, to substitute the study of St. Bonaventure, i.e. For Scotus, for two reasons. First, because it's more easily grasped and more easily efficacy than Scotus. Second, because Scotus makes no substantial additions to the Bonaventurean synthesis, or in St. synthesis by explicitly all that done Scotus was later to unfold. And I think it's somewhat, in a certain sense, this is on page, the bottom of 15 and the top of 16, by the way. In a certain sense, I find that a rather provocative statement. He's not the first one to say something like that. But I think in light of what you just said, precisely when you consider the contribution of Scotus on the absolute primacy and on the Immaculate Conception, which especially are theological topics, but certainly not without their philosophical connection, that's kind of an interesting way of stating it. And I certainly understand where he's coming from, but on the other hand, it seems like if you're not careful, you can shortchange exactly what Scotus actually provided insofar as contribution. And I wonder what you have to offer with that.
No, I completely agree with you. I think what Bettoni may be operating is a very extended sense of implicit with respect to Bonaventure, because I think on the one hand, Bonaventure really should have affirmed, based upon his sermons on Our Lady, where he affirms the co-redemption. Father Peter has demonstrated this without question, and so did his Father Peter's mentor, Lorenzo di Fonso. They demonstrated this without question, which, of course, if Mary is going to be co-redemptrix, she has to be immaculate in order for this to work out, both in terms of fittingness and in terms of how she personally and causally can function as co-redemptrix. And on the question of the absolute primacy of charity, Bonaventure again should have affirmed the absolute primacy of Christ, but he didn't. I think you have to recognize that fact that he didn't affirm it. And for whatever reason, Scotus was graced with the insights with respect to the absolute primacy and the Immaculate Conception. And if you don't understand those as essential and central developments within the Franciscan school, but they're, somehow ancillary, everything that matters in the Franciscan school is present in Bonaventure sufficiently, well, then either you're going to, like you said, make the absolute primacy and the Immaculate Conception somehow secondary or non-essential to the Franciscan school of thought, or you're going to have to use a very extended sense of implicit. I mean, I think implicitly Bonaventure's principles should have affirmed the Immaculate Conception and the absolute primacy, but he didn't. And Scotus did, and of course this really presents the capstone and point of radical, concrete clarity within the Franciscan school, is the absolute primacy.
It's kind of like, as it were, kind of like a coloration, as it were. It'd be interesting, as it were, when you consider Battoni's presentation, and there are many fine things that he has to say. I have to say that the text as it is, even with what we're discussing here, I personally find it to be quite a beautiful presentation. But it's kind of like when you then draw out with the contribution of Scotus, it would be kind of like, it would be interesting to know what the coloration, as it were, to the considering the unique contribution of Scotus.
Yeah, I think hopefully we can come to that, and that can be made more explicit throughout the course of our discussion. I think on the one hand, it's very clear that Scotus brings a level of precision that is absent in Bonaventure. I think that's manifestly clear. Scotus does not write anything nearly as beautiful as virtually every text of Bonaventure. And, of course, the principles of the absolute primacy of Christ and the Immaculate Conception, those are obvious points of development, and one might even say points of contrast, at least in terms of explicit verbal formulation between Bonaventure and Scotus. So those things I think should be brought out, and if the Academy of the Immaculate were to publish a second or third edition of Battoni's Nothing for Your Journey, you'd have to have at least a Marian foreword or epilogue in order to bring this all together. And then, but on the other hand, I wonder if he's not onto something with his assertion that Bonaventure, in a certain way, could be more privileged than Scotus as more practically accessible. Because I think in that sense it is correct. Bonaventure is more easily read than Duns Scotus. And so that has certain merit to it. If one can see in the perspective of a synthetic view that when you insert or reincorporate, in a sense retrojectively, the Immaculate Conception and the absolute primacy, Bonaventure's synthesis is fairly complete. But of course he doesn't arrive at that himself. And another kind of apologetical mode, I think that is interesting and perhaps important to consider, is that Bonaventure is considered less dangerous than Scotus by many people. And so, if you can kind of, nurse and then wean, rather than presenting Scotus as kind of the icebreaker or deal breaker, maybe through Bonaventure people could become more sympathetic to Scotus. And so in that sense, it has a certain apologetic efficacy.
Jared, there's another comment that I have, and that has to do with the term voluntarism. And yes, we all know that this is a real tricky one, and it caused many people to stumble and to excoriate practically the Franciscan school and to lump Scotus in as the precursor of Occam, Kant, and all the rest. And so it seems worthwhile at some point, to the point where somebody suggested, oh, if we only had just the perfect term, that's not quite voluntarism, but something else, and so on and so forth, to distinguish. It seems like at some point in these series of lectures that we are able to, for example, be able to take a critical analysis, that we were able to critically analyze when people denigrate, let's say, the proper form of the Franciscan voluntarism that is outlined in Bonaventure and Scotus versus the criticisms that have been leveled even by people such as Pope Benedict XVI,
Right.
who appeared to lump Scotus in as the precursor of Occam, and in the Regensburg text, just examples. Anyway, just that observation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that is very important. And the only explanation possible of why you can affirm a kind of Franciscan voluntarism, and I do admit I think the term is being used provocatively. I wonder if Bottoni is doing that somewhat intentionally, just to get people to be shocked enough to consider what he's saying. But I think, on the other hand, it has a negative connotation that it almost outweighs the use. But yeah, I think the explanation for why the Franciscan tradition doesn't affirm a kind of gross voluntarism resides precisely in the application in God first of a concept of infinity, the divine being as infinite, and the use of the formal distinction. Those two aspects of the Franciscan tradition's thought allows for a certain priority or prioritizing of love over knowledge, without in any way implying that the will should or even can operate in irrational or unintelligent manner, as Pope Benedict seemed to imply. One thing, though, about that speech at Regensburg and later his what were they, July 7th or 8th, 2010, those two audiences he gave on Duns Scotus, where he seemed to link nominalism or voluntarism with Scotus, is he later clarified those comments because he was criticized, and he distanced explicitly Scotus from the kind of voluntarism that came later in the Acts of the Apostolic See, the official documents of these, or official locations of these two speeches. He distanced himself from that interpretation. So that's good. I don't know if you're aware of that. I'm sure, yes. But no, I think that is an important thing to deal with. I'm noting that down. I think one thing is that on page 23, Bottoni himself, in a sense, began to speak to this. It says, page 23, kind of towards the bottom of the page, it recognized that the Seraphic Doctor observed that St. Francis's way of living is not the only way, for there is another way, but one that is quite longer and, if you will, more dangerous, but more common and more human. And this is the way that begins with study in order to arrive at love. That's the point. Intellect is ordered to love. There's a certain priority there. It has always been the firm and common view of St. Bonaventure and of the whole Franciscan school that the thing that counts above all is love, and knowledge has value only insofar as it is a way to charity. And I think that at least implies that, one, knowledge is for the sake ultimately of acting in charity, for being in a state of charity. But on the other hand, it in its very inclusion, in charity's realizations, inclusion of knowledge, it at least begins to blunt a kind of conception of Franciscan thought that says, knowledge can charity or the will can somehow be divorced from knowledge. And I think we can begin to flesh that out a bit, because yeah, you're correct. It would be baneful to leave people with the impression that Franciscan voluntarism is simply Kantian or worse, Occamistic voluntarism. So, Alex,
I just have to take off. Just want to say
you're taking off.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we should probably wrap it up unless there are a few more questions. I'll see you, Alex. Thanks a lot.
Bye, guys.
So, any questions? Any observations? Everything good? Everybody have an idea of what to read and what to think about for next Friday?
More or less, yeah.
Okay.
I think for us, audio would be fine. We're actually, Charles, we're actually recording it as well, I might point out.
Well, I think that can sum it up for the afternoon, if that is acceptable to everyone else.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Well, Father Lewis, would you close us in a word of prayer, please?
In the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Our Lady, mediatrix of all graces.
Pray for us.
In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend and a blessed Sunday.
You too.
Thank you, Mr. Goff. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Hallelujah.